Everyone, welcome back. Miss Calabrese here. And we're going to be talking about the circulatory system again, and today we're going to be getting a little bit more in depth into the vessels. All right, so just to review your overall circulation, right? Your circulatory system is a closed system with a central pump, and that pump is the heart. The heart pumps on two circuits: the pulmonary circuit, where it's sending deoxygenated blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen, and then the systemic circuit, which is going to send that oxygenated blood out to the rest of the body. Right, there are places in your body where we find multiple different vessels going to the same area, right? And the point of these vessels is to deliver oxygenated blood to the tissue so the tissues can use that oxygen. So when we find multiple different vessels going to the same spot, we refer to that as collateral circulation. And that's basically like giving another route for that blood to get to the same area of tissue. So if one vessel becomes occluded or blocked, the other vessel can carry the oxygenated blood to the tissue beyond that point. All right, so as far as the structure of vessels go here, so each blood vessel is going to have three different layers, whether we're talking about an artery or a vein. Each one of them has three layers. The innermost layer is the tunica interna, which some books refer to as the tunica intima. That tunica interna is epithelial tissue, so it's simple squamous epithelium. The epithelial tissue that lines the inside of your circulatory tract is sometimes referred to as endothelial tissue, so this is endothelium. The middle layer of tissue, or the middle tunic, is the tunica media. Tunica media is basically made of smooth muscle, so this is muscular tissue. This is useful for dilation and contraction or dilation and constriction, I should say, of these vessels. And then tunica externa, that's basically a connective tissue covering around the outside of the vessel, helps to anchor it into place in your tissue so it's not moving all around as blood moves through it. So notice those three layers are present on both the artery and the vein, but those three layers are not present on a capillary. So capillaries are your smallest vessels. Capillaries basically just have one layer of endothelium attached to a basement membrane. Okay, so again, yeah, that tunica interna, that's the innermost lining. It's endothelial tissue that lines the entire cardiovascular system. Tunica media is smooth muscle that's going to help regulate the diameter, so can relax and contract in order to widen or narrow the diameter of the vessel. And then the tunica externa is that connective tissue covering that's going to anchor the vessel to the surrounding tissue. All right, so of your different blood vessel types, so we mentioned arteries, veins, and capillaries, but we're going to throw in some other vessels here. So a small artery is called an arteriole, right? So these arterioles are smaller than your typical artery. A small vein is called a venule, right? So and those arterioles and venules are both slightly larger than capillaries. So if we're looking at where you're holding most of your blood, at any given time, if you took a picture of like where all the blood is in your body, most of it's going to be in veins. About 64% of the blood is in veins at any given time, with a much smaller percent that's in the actual arteries. All right, and remember that arteries are taking blood away from the heart, so any vessels going away from the heart are arteries. Any vessels returning to the heart are veins. Okay. All right, so looking at the structure of some of your large arteries. So we can kind of define arteries based on the composition of those different tunics. So elastic arteries, these are your largest arteries. So your aorta, for example, is an elastic artery. And that means that there's a lot of elastic fibers in the wall of that artery that allow it to stretch. And that stretching is going to be really important for vessels that are very, very close to the heart, because as every time the heart beats, it's going to push blood with very high pressure into these close vessels, and the vessels need to be able to expand in order to handle that pressure without tearing essentially, right? So your elastic arteries have a high amount of elastic and a really thin tunica externa so that they can stretch easily. The next largest arteries would be your muscular arteries. And this is a slow transition. It's not like you have, elastic artery 1 second and muscular artery the next. As the arteries get further away from your heart, they're going to get less and less elastic tissue and more muscular tissue, more tunica externa. Um, so these muscular arteries are also called distributing arteries, and so they've got more of that muscle tone, which allows them to help maintain blood pressure and flow to different areas in your body. And then the last picture on the right-hand side there is a cross-section of the wall of an arteriole. So arterioles, much smaller vessels here. They still have the three layers, so there's still a tunica intima, tunica media, and a tunica externa, but it's all just scaled down, so much smaller. Okay, so let's look at where we find those arterioles. So the further we get away from the heart, our elastic arteries become muscular arteries and then eventually become arterioles. And arterioles are the last vessel that we go through before we hit a capillary bed. So arterioles are the vessels that are responsible for delivering blood to the capillaries. We oftentimes refer to arterioles as being resistance vessels. And that's we call them that because they're able to adjust blood pressure and change the resistance of flow by closing off little tiny smooth muscle rings called sphincters. Right. So in this picture here we can see an arteriole that's leading to a capillary bed. Right, so the capillary bed would be in this region here. But the blood that's coming down this arteriole and heading towards that capillary bed, in order to be allowed to go into the capillary bed, it's going to have to pass through these precapillary sphincters. So if the sphincters are open, they'll let blood flow into the capillary bed. If those sphincters are closed, then blood just has to keep flowing right on by, and it'll go find the next capillary bed, down the road a little bit. So these resistance vessels allow us to kind of turn on and turn off blood flow to certain capillary beds in the body. And because of the uh, the ability to do that, we can get really big drops in blood pressure at this level in the body, right? So down to these very small vessels, that is where the blood pressure really is going to drop off before we enter the capillary bed. Right, so here's another picture of that. So we can see the capillary bed here. We can see our arteriole here, and these little smooth muscle rings, these precapillary sphincters, that when those are relaxed, blood will be able to flow into the capillary bed, and when they're constricted, blood will not be able to flow into those capillary beds. So this is going to be pretty important because of how many capillary beds you have in your body. You do not have enough blood to fill all of the blood vessels in your body all the time. So your body basically has to make decisions and open up this capillary bed and then close down the one next to it and open up the next one down and then close the one after that. And it just kind of alternates which capillary beds get filled and which don't, because we just don't have enough blood to fill all of them at the same time. If we tried to open up all the precapillary sphincters and fill all the capillary beds in your body, your blood pressure would drop so low, you'd probably die, right? So there just is not enough blood in your body to maintain pressure if we keep all of these open. All right, so then the whole reason that we need to get blood to capillary beds is because the capillaries are the exchange vessels. So that means that's where gas exchange takes place and that's where nutrient exchange takes place. So all this fresh red blood that's coming into these capillaries here is carrying a lot of oxygen and carrying a lot of nutrients. And then the oxygen and nutrients are going to diffuse across those capillary walls into the surrounding tissue. And diffusion is going to happen the other way too, and that wastes from those cells and carbon dioxide from these tissues is going to diffuse into the capillary bed. And now that blood that's kind of full of carbon dioxide and waste is going to be flowing back into the venule, which is the small vein here, and then eventually back to the heart. All right. So again, capillaries have a slightly different structure. They don't have those three different tunics. They're much simpler in structure, so it's basically just one simple layer of endothelial cells attached to a basement membrane. All right, so here are some of the different types of capillaries you have in your body. So the most common type of capillary is continuous. So a continuous capillary is one where we have those endothelial cells are held together here by tight junctions, but there's still intercellular clefts that are going to allow for nutrients and gases to pass in and out of the circulatory system. The next most common type is the fenestrated. So fenestrated capillaries, they have the intercellular clefts, but they also have these little pores in them called fenestrations, and that allows for greater permeability. So that means even more stuff can filter in and out of these capillaries. So we find these in your kidneys, because obviously the kidneys are organs of filtration, so we need the greater filtering ability. And then your small intestine as well, and that's because your small intestine is where we're actually picking up nutrients that you just ate, right? So the nutrients that are coming out of your digestive tract and then moving into the bloodstream are entering through the fenestrated capillaries of the small intestine. Right, and then the last type of capillary here is a sinusoid capillary. Sinusoid capillaries have really big gaps in between the cells. So in between those endothelial cells, there are these large gaps, or sinuses. And that's so that we can allow really big protein molecules or entire cells to pass in and out of the capillary. And this is going to be especially important in places like the bone marrow, for example, because the bone marrow is where you make blood cells. So once you've made them in that bone marrow, they need to be able to get into the bloodstream, and they're going to do it through these large intercellular gaps in a sinusoid capillary. All right, so let's talk about the veins and the venules a little bit. So after blood goes through the capillary bed, then it's going to pass into a venule, which is a small vein. And then small venules are going to merge together to veins, and then small veins merge together into becoming larger veins. And eventually we get all the way back up to the largest veins in your body, which are the superior and inferior vena cava. Now, veins, we mentioned before, this is where most of your blood is going to be located at any given time. That's because veins have much lower pressure than arteries do, so blood's moving more slowly through the veins. Um, and it can be difficult to keep the blood flowing in one direction because of how low the pressure is. So if you think about it, the veins are as far away from the pump as you can get. So if your heart is the pump, when the heart pumps, it's got to pump through the elastic arteries and muscular arteries, and then the arterioles and the capillary beds and the venules and then the veins. So the venules and veins are as far away from the heart as we can get, which means pressure is really, really low. So we have to do several different things to make sure that we're keeping the blood actually flowing back towards the heart to prevent backflow. And one of the key things, one of the key structures that prevents backflow in veins are valves. So veins have valves, arteries do not have valves. All right, so let's look at those pressure changes as we move further and further away from the heart. So here we're measuring blood pressure on the side. So the lower pressure here, diastolic pressure, and then the systolic pressure up here. So with every heartbeat, there's a low diastolic and then a high systolic, and it just goes back and forth and back and forth. And if we're measuring this in terms of distance from the heart, right? So the aorta is closest to the heart, and then we get some of these larger elastic and distributing arteries. Then we get into the arterioles, and you can see as we're getting into the arterioles, blood pressure starts to drop pretty quickly because now we're really spreading that blood around into a great number of very tiny arterioles. And then as we go through the capillaries, pressure drops even more. As we coalesce into the venules, pressure drops even more. And by the time we're back into those couple large vessels that lead back into the heart here, the vena cava, we're at very, very low pressure, right? So highest pressure is coming out of the heart, and then as we circle back around, the pressure is getting lower and lower and lower until we get back into the heart. Okay, a quick mention on varicose veins. So varicose veins are when you have an incompetent valve. So like I said, the further away from the heart we get, the lower the blood pressure is. And if pressure is low, then we're not going to be able to keep that blood flowing towards the heart. It's going to want to flow backwards. That's where valves come into play. So the valves prevent the backflow, but if a valve becomes incompetent or weak for some reason, then blood just pools behind. So here we can see it. The blood is just kind of falling behind where that valve is and it's pooling underneath it. So that's what's happening to this poor person here, is that the blood is pooling behind a valve because the valve is incompetent. It's not doing its job. All right, so a few questions here. What vessels carry blood away from the heart? What vessels carry blood toward the heart? What vessels are involved in gas and nutrient exchange? What's another name for the innermost layer of a blood vessel? And what type of tissue is that made of? What's an occlusion? Which vessels have thicker walls and more muscle? Which vessels have higher pressure? And then which ones have valves and why do they have valves? All right, so I know it's a lot of questions. I'll give you a second to think about it. All right, and hopefully you came up with these answers. So the vessels that carry blood away from the heart are always arteries. Vessels that carry blood towards the heart are always veins. The ones involved in exchange are the capillaries. The innermost layer of all blood vessels is the tunica interna, sometimes called the tunica intima, and that's made of endothelial tissue, which is simple squamous epithelium. An occlusion is just a blockage in a vessel. The vessels that have the thicker walls and more muscle are arteries. The ones that have higher pressure are also arteries. And the ones that have valves are veins, and the reason they have them is to prevent backflow. All right, so let's get into the specifics of how exchange works. So we mentioned that your capillaries are your exchange vessels. So the capillaries are incredibly important. They're the ones that are really doing the exchange of nutrients, which is what the circulatory system is for, is to deliver nutrients and gases to the tissues all over the body. And they work pretty amazingly, mostly just by diffusion. So just by a couple processes of diffusion here. And these are called Starling forces. The two important ones that we need to understand are blood hydrostatic pressure and blood colloid osmotic pressure. All right, so we'll start with the blood hydrostatic pressure. This is just the actual pressure of the blood that's flowing through the vessel. So think of it like, in fact, think of your entire circulatory system as plumbing, right? So if we have high water pressure, that's going to feel very different than if you have low water pressure within those pipes, right? So the blood hydrostatic pressure is the pressure that's pushing on the inside of the vessel as the blood is entering a capillary bed from the heart. Right, so the higher the pressure you have, the higher the blood hydrostatic pressure, the more force you're putting on that capillary wall, and the more stuff that's just going to leak out of that capillary. So nutrients can leak out, gases can leak out, and fluid can leak out of that capillary wall, excuse me, into the surrounding tissue. So this is where we get interstitial fluid from. So interstitial fluid being the fluid that accumulates between cells in your tissues. Right, it's basically filtered plasma. It's plasma that's gotten filtered through the intercellular clefts of a capillary, being forced out by blood hydrostatic pressure. All right, so although we do lose a lot of our plasma to interstitial fluid because of the blood hydrostatic pressure, we also actually suck some of that fluid back into the cardiovascular system through blood colloid osmotic pressure. So blood colloid osmotic pressure works because in that bloodstream, you're going to have large cells, large proteins that are too big to cross over in between those intercellular clefts of the capillary bed. And so those larger molecules are just stuck in the blood vessel. And the fact that they're stuck in the blood vessel they will act as an osmotic draw. So they're basically drawing fluid back in, drawing water back in through the process of osmosis, because there exist these large particles on the inside of the capillary bed. All right, so blood hydrostatic pressure is forcing liquid out. Blood colloid osmotic pressure is pulling liquid back in. Now these two forces are not going to be equal. All right, so you will have blood hydrostatic pressure is usually greater than blood colloid osmotic pressure, meaning that we have some fluid that's going to be extra fluid that's going to be lingering in the tissue that does not make its way back into the bloodstream. Right? So there's almost as much resorbed as there is filtered, but not quite. So the difference ends up to be about 3 liters a day of fluid that has entered the tissues and left the cardiovascular system. And we have to recover that fluid, right? You can't just constantly be adding all this extra fluid to your tissue. So we do recover that fluid, but it's going to enter your lymphatic system before it finds its way back to your cardiovascular system. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that process works next week. All right, so let's talk about gas and nutrient exchange here. So this is incredibly important, right? It's the whole point of these exchange vessels. So what's happening here is mainly just diffusion. So when the blood goes to the lungs, so your right heart pumps the blood to the lungs, then we'll have gas exchange at the lungs where we drop off carbon dioxide, exhale that, and then you're breathing in oxygen, and that oxygen will get transferred to the hemoglobin of the red blood cells, and then those red blood cells are going to carry that oxygen all over the body. So here we are leaving the heart, we're going to the tissues, we're carrying all this oxygen to the tissues. As we get into a capillary bed here, there are going to be some concentration gradients that are important for what happens next. Right, so as we enter into the capillary bed, we're going to have a high amount of oxygen because we just picked up oxygen from the heart. The tissue, on the other hand, so here are some tissue cells over here. This tissue has been undergoing a lot of cellular respiration. So because it's been undergoing cellular respiration, it's been using a lot of oxygen. So, and when we use a lot of oxygen for cellular respiration, we also create a lot of carbon dioxide. So we have high oxygen in the bloodstream and low oxygen in the tissue, and that's going to cause oxygen to diffuse this way. So it's going to diffuse from the capillary to the tissue, right? It goes from high concentration to low concentration. So there's normal diffusion. And the same thing is going to be true for carbon dioxide. By the time we hit the other side of this capillary bed here, we're going to be low on oxygen because we've already lost most of the oxygen to diffusion. Um, and we're going to be low on carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide that's been building up in these tissue cells here because they've been undergoing a lot of cellular respiration is going to then flow into the capillary bed. So just high concentration of carbon dioxide in the tissue flows to the lower concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood. Right, so it's always diffusion. It's just that diffusion is working both ways here. For oxygen to move into the tissues and for carbon dioxide to move from the tissues into the vessels. All right. So I mentioned that your veins are carrying a good amount of blood at any given time. For that reason, we refer to them as blood reservoirs. So that's where blood is just kind of hanging out, moving slowly until you need it. So if we need blood for whatever reason in a particular area, then blood can be diverted from those veins to wherever it's needed at any given time. All right, so, but moving blood through the veins can be a little bit tricky just because of the pressure differences. So remember that the veins have very, very low pressure, almost none, compared to the pressure that your arteries have. All right, so there are 4 different ways that your veins accomplish getting blood back to the heart. All right, so the first way that your veins get blood back to the heart is through the skeletal muscle pump. And that's basically what it sounds like. This is just the contraction of skeletal muscles. So like what's going on in this picture here. So if we contract gastrocnemius here and we contract tibialis anterior here, as we contract those muscles, the muscle bellies get big and they start to put pressure on the vein that's in between them. Right? As they put pressure on that vein that's in between them, remember that veins have valves, so that it can't flow back down. The blood has to flow up. And once it flows up past this valve, now it's up here, and if I flex these muscles up here in the thigh, it'll again squeeze the blood upward. Right? So skeletal muscle pump is just flexion of muscles to squeeze, put pressure on veins to squeeze the blood back up toward the heart. Right, so that's one of the reasons why, you know, it's if you've been sitting still or laying for a long time, it's good to get up and walk around because that blood is just kind of pooling in your veins, waiting for the skeletal muscle pump to draw it back up into toward the heart. Um, so that's the skeletal muscle pump and the valves, right? Valves are crucial at getting that skeletal muscle pump to work. Another important thing that the veins or that your body does to get that blood up through those veins back towards the heart is the respiratory pump. So respiratory pump is pressure differences that happen in your thoracic and abdominal cavities when you take breaths in and out, right? So breathing in as you contract your diaphragm and expand your thoracic cavity, you increase the volume but reduce the pressure inside your thoracic cavity. So that pressure difference is actually going to draw blood upward towards the thoracic cavity. So just general breathing is enough pressure differences inside the cavities of your body to draw that blood back up towards the heart. So that's the respiratory pump. And the other thing that veins are capable of is venoconstriction. So venoconstriction is actually contracting the smooth muscle lining of that tunica media, and that's going to help push blood in the upward direction back towards the heart. All right, last few questions here. What causes fluid to flow out of capillaries? What causes it to flow back into capillaries? How do nutrients and waste flow in and out of capillaries? And what are the 4 components of venous blood return? All right, so here's your answers. The fluid flowing out of capillaries is because of blood hydrostatic pressure. Fluid flowing back into capillaries is because of blood colloid osmotic pressure. The nutrients and wastes moving across the capillaries is because of diffusion. And the 4 main components of venous blood return are valves, the respiratory pump, skeletal muscle pump, and just plain old venoconstriction. All right, so I hope that was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions.